This video is sponsored by Wicked Dicey and their Summer Slaughter GT. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and with 11th edition 40k fast approaching, I think it's time to review the factions in Warhammer 40k and how they will be changing in terms of core rule interactions and playstyle with the release of the new edition. Now, at the time of recording, it is Wednesday, May 20th, and so we don't have all of the new mechanics from the new edition revealed to us quite yet, so I'm going to be discussing this mostly in context of the rules changes that we know of right now. And with that, let's hop into a breakdown of every faction, starting with the Imperium factions and moving down in alphabetical order. This begins with Adepta Sororitas, and as we've already seen, character combinations seem much stronger in Adepta Sororitas. The changes to leadership mechanics means that a lot of characters aren't necessarily going to need to lead a unit in order to gain benefits. Independent units like Junith Irawita, for example, are going to be potentially gaining a -1 to hit effect by themselves, which stacks with their already resilient defensive profile, making them an even better backline operator or a utility unit. I think there's also going to be a move, sort of bifurcation between these characters who can utilize leader abilities without having to join units, as well as large units that use overlapping character synergies using the new leader and support character mechanics, and in conjunction with enhancements like the Hagiomnifex, which can provide massive buffs to the attached units. Things like Celestian Sacrosants, for example, that you're able to take a large unit of resilient infantry and then stack several overlapping buffs between enhancements, unit upgrades, character, leadership abilities, all of those together, I think are going to really send those units through the stratosphere. So on one hand, I think that there is going to be a push towards more independent characters and more small unit character play, and those will be working in conjunction with these big, heavier units attaching multiple characters or high impact characters. Now, that said, I do think the new cover rules are going to mean that these light infantry that have good armor saving throws, so Adepta Sororitas come in at only toughness 3, which means a lot of wounds are converting. However, with a 3+ armor save in the previous edition, in 10th edition, they essentially had a baked-in Armor of Contempt effect against most incoming shooting because they were benefiting from cover. It seems like the new cover rules are going to be harder to apply. They don't apply to your armor save anymore. They apply to your hit roll. And so these high armor save units are not going to be impacted quite as much. Now, fortunately for Adepta Sororitas, they do have invulnerable saves to fall back on, but their invuln saves are not that strong. So I do think there's going to be less of an instance of Adepta Sororitas being able to sort of scam their way out of tight situations by utilizing a strong armor save plus cover together. That said, light infantry like Sisters Repentia or Archoflagellants are actually, on the whole, slightly more impacted by cover, since more often than not, their armor saving throws were being entirely negated. Gaining access to the -1 to hit effect from cover, in addition to having an invulnerable save, on top of like poor existing defensive stats, is actually a slight improvement in their survivability. So it's not all bad for Adepta Sororitas light infantry units, but I wouldn't expect things like 5 Battle Sisters to survive in cover quite as often as they did in 10th edition. Now, with that, we're going to move over to Adeptus Custodes, and Custodes do have some very similar unit profiles to Adepta Sororitas, in that they use Anathema Psychona units, which are these 3+ save light infantry profiles, and are similarly affected in the same way that Adepta Sororitas are. That said, as we have seen for Adeptus Custodes, there is a new emphasis on using Anathema Psychona units in your army, and I think that's going to massively improve Custodes' ability to participate in scenarios. We already see that there are mechanics that allow things like Anathema Psychona units to advance and perform actions, which dramatically improves Custodes' utility when it comes to either playing non-kill-centric primary missions or completing your secondary actions more consistently, even with a relatively low model count. So already it looks pretty good for Custodes. In addition to that, the fact that Adeptus Custodes very heavily uses infantry keyworded units means that they interact with the hidden mechanic to a greater extent than a lot of other factions do, and I do think that one potential use case of the hidden mechanic is going to be to help forward deploy or deploy more aggressively these really scary heavy infantry units, so things like Custodian Guard Squads and Custodian Wardens. If your opponent's not able to reach out and touch those units on the top of the first turn, you can use Hidden to deploy them a little bit more aggressively than you did previously without the need for an expensive transport like a Land Raider or a Coronis Grav Carrier. And your opponent's not going to be able to shoot them with heavy infantry sweepers, which is just huge. There's also the fact that oftentimes the units that were purpose-built to destroy Custodes are these like AP3 heavy infantry blast weapons or anti-heavy infantry blast weapons that would put them on their invulnerable save even through the old cover mechanics. In those cases, against those specific weapon types, Adeptus Custodes are going to benefit from the new cover mechanics. So even the fact that they are likely largely reliant on their 2+ armor saves, because they already have a strong invulnerable save, they aren't necessarily totally depowered by the changes to cover. So I think that their interaction with terrain may incentivize a more infantry-focused playstyle, which is able to, play aggressively with these relatively tanky, hard-hitting, and in some cases fast if you're able to improve their speed or take things like Blade Champions, heavy infantry squads. Now, on top of that, the fly keyword is a huge improvement for flying vehicles, especially units that could previously not go through terrain features and had to maneuver around them. Now being able to pay 2 inches of movement in order to go over terrain features is enormous, and I do think that we are going to enter a new era of these flying gunship style units, these move 10, move 12, move 14, ranged attacking monsters and vehicles being able to stand behind a structure and then jump all the way over that structure and attack, even in the cases of things we've already seen, things like Defilers, for example, in the current 10th edition metagame. That capacity to start outside of a ruin and then jump to the other side of the ruin and gain line of sight is enormous. And obviously it's a little bit less powerful with these new fly mechanics, but I don't think that it's dramatically less impactful. So units like the Caladius Grav Tank being able to deploy defensively and then hop out and destroy enemy vehicles is going to be huge. But before we move on to the next faction, let's hear from our sponsor.
Have you ever wanted to be ruthlessly and brutally slaughtered? Well, I have good news for you, because the date of your execution is set to August 14th through 16th, 2026 in Plainsboro Township, New Jersey. And that's because this video has been sponsored by Wicked Dicey and their event, The Slaughter. This represents the return of a long-running event that saw its rebirth last year. I was there, I live streamed it, and it was a great time. It includes a 5-round Warhammer 40,000 grand tournament, as well as events for Age of Sigmar, Star Wars Legion, and many other games. On top of that, Wicked Dicey always goes out of their way to put on a great show, creating a fun and inclusive convention atmosphere. So even if you're just participating in a tournament, there are plenty of other things to do and people to hang out with the entire weekend. And they always work extensively with local tournament organizers to ensure that all of their events for all of their games are fair and well run. So if you're looking for any gaming action this summer, I highly recommend you check out Wicked Dicey's Slaughter. You can find more information in the links on the video right here or in the video description to get your tickets today.
And that moves us over to Adeptus Mechanicus, for whom, at least at the time of recording, it doesn't feel like too much has changed. There is going to be a bit of a recontextualization of the faction using the new cover mechanics. The fact that cover no longer applies to saving throws means that low AP shooting is slightly more useful. So if we're talking about things like stubbers or radium carbines or all of this AP0 shooting that you can then apply Conqueror imperative onto in Adeptus Mechanicus to gain 1 pip of AP if you have a battle line unit nearby, to push those weapons to AP1 and just drown your opponent in mass AP1 attacks is actually significantly more lethal than we've seen previously. There's also the case that Adeptus Mechanicus do have a pretty reasonable access to ignore cover attacks themselves. It's not universal, and there's a lot of stuff obviously that does get impacted by cover, but the fact that a lot of these low AP weapons are not necessarily going to suffer the downsides of that cover mechanic coming back in while gaining the upsides of having low AP that now actually works on your target does mean that they are going to look a little bit better in some matchups. That said, changes to heavy do massively improve the other Doctrina that they have access to, the Protector Imperative. This gives the entire army heavy and the ability to still move even a small amount and gain the benefit of heavy does mean that you're much more often incentivized to enter Protector Imperative, whereas in 10th edition, the Conquer Imperative was basically universally the correct call. There's also some very slight changes to things like ingress rules, where the fact that objective markers tend to be larger and ingress denial areas, so that the zone at which you can prevent enemies from deep striking near you, is also smaller, means that units that move after ingressing, so things like Taraxi Skystalkers, for example, are not insignificantly harder to stop. There is, counterplay inside the current edition where if you're able to screen out an objective with a broad enough aura, even units like Taraxi dropping in, shooting, and then moving aren't going to be able to take that objective away from you. That's a little bit more difficult in this new edition. It's also more difficult to fully screen out objectives in this new edition. So that is, I think, a very slight benefit to Adeptus Mechanicus, who tend to use those mechanics a little bit more than many other factions. However, as I said before, I don't know if too much is changing thus far. Now, there is going to be some paradigm shifts in Astra Militarum. I do think Astra Militarum utilized and relied very heavily on the existing 10th edition cover mechanics more than most other factions in the game. The fact that it's an army composed almost entirely lacking in vulnerable saves and reliant on armor save stacking means that the loss of cover adding to your armor save is a huge deal for this faction. The fact that they also have multiple ways to gain things like hit modifiers and gain cover in other situations, even when not on terrain features, means that they are sort of additionally impacted by these cover mechanic changes. Now, if you have things that ignore hit modifiers or gain bonuses to hit or things like that, they are going to be less impacted by cover that Astra Militarum can grant themselves, whereas Astra Militarum are not now able to rely on cover to stack with things like the take cover order to dramatically improve their saving throw. This means that a lot of Militarum infantry are basically capped at like a 4+ armor save, which in a lot of cases can be very easily ignored by incoming low AP shooting. So I would expect to see a move away from these defensive stacks. I also think as well that there's probably going to be a slight move away from things like main battle tanks. So right now, Rogel Thorns and Leman Russ and Vanquishers and things like these are sort of the mainstay of Astra Militarum armies. And while I don't know necessarily if that's going to change wholesale, because that is where a lot of the actual damage output from Militarum armies comes from, they do have, strong infantry units, but it's able to put out a lot of relatively middling strength attack. There's a lot of plasma and melted gunfire that comes in at strength 8 or strength 10 that doesn't necessarily punch through high save character or toughness characteristic enemies. You do need the battle tanks in order to do that. However, those battle tanks aren't going to be the defensive powerhouses that they were in 10th edition. There's also the fact that Astra Militarum are double affected by Battle Shock. Unlike many other factions, their army abilities entirely turn off when they become Battle Shocked, so they're no longer able to benefit from orders. So the fact that a Battle Shock is changing to potentially perpetually affect a unit, if it continues to fail subsequent Battle Shock checks, can be really devastating for an Astra Militarum army if your key units are affected by a Battle Shock mechanic and you're then unable to undo that. So we may see a push towards more leadership modifying units, things like commissars who can, destroy models to unbattle shock units, or higher leadership characters. And that moves us on to Grey Knights, who is probably one of the most improved factions with the previews that we've seen thus far. We are just coming off of, at the time of recording, the Grey Knight preview article, which had some phenomenal looking abilities for the faction. The other big change is the change to the psychic keyword, and any faction that relies heavily on psychic weapons is going to be just monumentally improved by these new mechanics. Psychic weapons naturally ignore cover, they ignore hit roll modifiers, they ignore ballistic skill modifiers, and that makes so many more weapons viable. The big thing here is that not only are these psychic weapons like psy cannons, silencers, for example, not suffering the -1 to hit for shooting into cover, they are also not suffering the previous cover mechanic either. So previously, psychic had no benefit, and you were shooting AP1 or AP0 weapons into an opponent who had improved armor save characteristics. So the chances that those weapons actually punch through armor saves was just minuscule fuel in most cases. So you kind of just threw Stormbolters and things that naturally ignored cover at your target and then hoped for the best, and you just ignored every other weapon option in the entire faction. Now, units like Purgation Squads, your characters that have psychic attacks, Librarians, the Epic Heroes, in addition to Paladins who are able to stack multiple sets of psychic heavy weapons, be that silencers, psy-cannons, or incinerators, probably psy-cannons most often. Those Paladin squads are able to take 5 or even 6 heavy weapons if you have an attached character. All of those look significantly more viable. They're just shooting into cover with absolutely no penalties whatsoever. AP1 weapons become significantly stronger, and not to mention the fact that if you have any natural defensive buffs, things like -1 to hit effects, for example, those psychic weapons are also ignoring those. This includes a lot of Terminator characters. The fact that you no longer necessarily need to be leading units to gain benefits for your leadership abilities means that characters like Brotherhood Librarians are getting kind of a 2-for-1. They not only have a powerful psychic attack that gets all the benefit of the psychic weapons, and also they will likely be able to shroud themselves, assuming that what we've seen previewed holds true, where leadership abilities now no longer require leading. The Librarians are going to be phenomenal individual utility units. There's also the potential that some characters become individual utility units. Brotherhood Champions, for example, are kind of like a laughingstock of a character. They aren't able to attach to a lot of the important units that you want them to hop into, whereas their leadership ability is relatively helpful. Being able to give themselves the leadership ability and giving you this little nuclear missile of an advancing and charging combat character is good, assuming that there are solid enhancements for the Brotherhood Champions that can improve their damage output. 5 attacks with 2 damage, they're not necessarily going to be killing many utility units by themselves unless you can improve their output. If you can improve their output, you could start to see these guys being taken in small numbers just as combat characters, which I think is a huge improvement for the faction. It gives you a wider breadth of options of datasheets that are viable to play. Now, we do see some core changes that I expect to come down the pipeline. That includes things like 6-inch ingress moves, so 6-inch deep strikes from, for example, Warpbane Task Force with Hallowed Beacon are likely to become less powerful since they now require a 7-inch charge to make a charge out of that reserve rather than the previous 6-inch charge to get a unit into engagement range. That's assuming that none of these mechanics change. We'll have to see if that ends up being the case, because we do see that the previous 9-inch ingress denial area has been reduced to 8 inches. It could be that these become 5-inch deep strikes, in which case they would be much more powerful. However, I expect to see them retain at 6 inches and become a 7-inch charge out of reserve, which makes any of these 6-inch deep striking effects significantly weaker. That said, we have seen a lot of other ways that this faction is going to be able to deliver their combat units into the fight. Things like the new detachment that buffs up your interceptors, for example, making them significantly faster, is going to make those units much better at delivering themselves anyway. So I think it might showcase a shift in the faction where you start to use those more offensive detachments more for delivering your ranged units, and then you use 1-point detachments to help deliver 1 or 2 specific melee datasheets that you've kind of constructed your composition around. And that moves us over to Space Marines. Now, Space Marines are getting a codex on launch, so it's going to be very difficult to discuss them in great detail because we literally just don't know what the faction's going to look like very shortly after the release of the edition. That said, there are going to be, I think, some through lines that will showcase a very dramatic change in how the faction plays from 10th edition. The big one is going to be the lack of stratagem stacking. Right now, a very common play pattern is that you can stack stuff together like Smokescreen, Armor of Contempt, and -1 to Wound in Blade of Ultramar to make individual units ridiculously difficult to kill. That will no longer be the case. If you use a stratagem on a unit, you can no longer use another stratagem on them for the remainder of that phase. That also prevents you from doing things like adding Armor of Contempt to a 2+ save unit and then re-rolling a failed saving throw. So a lot of that is going to make those units significantly easier to remove. In addition to that, Space Marines being an army that largely relies, not entirely, entirely, but mostly relies on armor saves, means that the new cover mechanics are actually slightly worse for Space Marines because they no longer get to stack multiple sets of armor or AP characteristic modifiers to make their units very, very resilient and very difficult to punch through for low AP weapons. However, on the flip side, the fact that characters may not necessarily need to lead the units to gain their benefits means that there may be more utility for independent or smash characters. However, there is the case that in a lot of cases, Space Marine characters do not only buff the unit they're attached to, but also gain buffs from a unit that they're attached to. For example, a lot of times you'll see a Spash captain that is attached into an Assault Intercessor squad so that the captain can give them free stratagems, and then the intercessors can give them wound rerolls, or Blade Guard veterans with a powerful character to give them reroll ones to hit. So I don't know necessarily if Space Marines are ready for a large number of Smash characters, but there are going to be some instances where characters may be able to be more viable without a specific unit to go with them. Things like Adrax Agatone, who gains wound rerolls in the current incarnation of the rules, being able to do that by himself is pretty cool. Corsaro Khan, gaining Lance himself might be a little bit more, have a little bit more utility on his own. Now, I didn't discuss Imperial Agents here, largely because I'm not really sure what's happening with that faction. The design team has said that the faction will still exist in 11th edition, but they won't get any support on release, so they won't get any new detachments. We don't know how many detachment points their existing detachments will be, and so it's very difficult to discuss them in a meaningful way. I do think the fact that they are, it tends to play a lot of high invulnerable save light infantry does mean that the new cover mechanics are going to be helpful for them, but it's a little bit more difficult to play keep away with the new objective markers, so I don't know if their primary objective control game plan is going to be quite as reliable as it has been in 10th edition. Now, I'm going to commit a little bit of sacrilege here, and I'm going to combine the Imperial and Chaos Knight factions together for one slide. I ended up basically just having a lot of similar things to say for the two factions, so I didn't want to do two separate sections where I just basically reiterated exactly the same points. That said, I do think there are a couple very minor differences between the two factions. Now, the first thing is that both of these armies tend to be reliant on high-volume, low-AP weapons. So this would be things like War Dog Executioners or Armiger Helvrins that are firing all of these autocannon shots that are only AP1, Avenger Gatling Cannons, which are coming in at mass AP2, and these were all very dramatically impacted by the old cover mechanics. Now, with the new cover mechanics, they are going to be less impacted, and you can even get around the new cover mechanics using the new plunging fire rules, which may force a little bit more focus in terms of actual combat power to the larger knights, the Titanic knights that are able to benefit from those towering plunging fire effects. There's a lot of random anti-fly in this faction as well. Things like Icarus autocannons that you could potentially be sticking on most of your big knights. And there's also the potential that those become more effective in an ecosystem where more flying units are seen, which in combination with the new cover rules making AP1 weapons more viable could be helpful. Although I don't know if the difference between those and things like Storm Spear rocket pods are that dramatic. However, one downside is that one thing that Knights were often able to do in 10th edition, because the edition used the objective zone control, where you had a 40mm marker and had to control 3 inches away from that. One thing that Knights could often do is just entirely subsume or threaten control of those objectives using their large base size. So a heavy Knight, a big Titanic Knight that has a huge base and huge OC, is able to basically occupy enough of that objective marker, if it's able to get far enough forward, that it's difficult for the opponent to get enough OC from infantry and the like to actually counter them on those objectives. Now, for a lot of these large base units, and this doesn't necessarily just apply to Knights, this is also going to be something that happens for Demons and Defilers and all these different kinds of profiles. One thing that's going to happen is that the fact that objective markers are now larger, they're terrain features, which means they now have vertical elements that can't be passed or can't be stood on by these big vehicles and things, means that blocking out enemies on objective markers is going to be difficult to impossible. Whereas previously, you could, for example, place a big knight sort of perpendicular to the angle of the table and essentially prevent enemies from going in without necessarily charging that knight, or even in some cases prevent them from even getting onto the objective with charging if you were able to sort of body block out the front of the objective. That could make it almost impossible for your opponent to actually contest that objective and sort of establish his dominance in the center of the battlefield. Now your opponent's going to be able to run utility units and high OC models onto that objective because it's much more difficult to be able to do that. So I do think that's something that's going to change quite a bit in terms of how these large units get played. The fact that there's also going to be more terrain in the center of the table because the objective markers in the middle will have these big movement blocking areas that you have to use Super Heavy Walker to get through. That's going to be a big deal. Speaking of Super Heavy Walker, that's also going to be a change. That means that if you suffer battle shock from the Super Heavy Walker movement, there's a potential that that battle shock remains there and sticks with you for multiple turns if you keep failing subsequent battle shock checks. And that could be absolutely brutal and potentially end the game very quickly if you are relying on that Knight's OC characteristic to hold down an objective. So that may incentivize more Armiger or War Dog play. And if I had to hazard a guess, it would be one of the reasons that the new plunging fire mechanics are such a benefit to these Titanic units or these towering units in combat. The larger knights are going to be where the majority of your damage is coming from. However, you're likely going to be more reliant on armatures or war dogs in these smaller vehicles in order to actually hold territory and control objectives. There is also the fact that you can probably be able to rely on allies like Chaos Demons or Imperial Agents in order to help fulfill this role, but it likely means that we're going to see a larger diversification in these knight armies. Now, last but certainly not least, obviously the changes to the Battle Shock mechanics are massively impactful for Chaos Knights. Chaos Knights do utilize Battle Shock quite a bit, and the fact that Battle Shock tests are going to be required multiple times for units in order to unbattle shock themselves is just massive, huge amounts of gravy for Chaos Knight armies, for whom Battle Shock mechanics were, in some cases, largely forgettable. Sometimes I watched Chaos Knight games where they would win the game, but they would literally forget to roll their Harbingers of Dread. They were just reliant on the fact that things like Despoilers were really good and they had good detachment abilities. They just would forget their army rule entirely. That's crazy, and I do think that the new mechanics are going to be huge for them. Now, that moves us into Chaos factions, and we can start by discussing the big one, Chaos Space Marines. And it's an interesting time to talk about Chaos Space Marines because at the time of recording, Chaos Space Marines are, I think, without a doubt, the best army in 40k. They are the highest performing army. They have multiple different builds that are doing fairly well, and a lot of it is on the back of things like the Defiler, but also just their strong heavy infantry and their pact-bound zealot combinations. So realistically, assuming we don't see huge changes to Chaos Space Marines, I don't really see that changing. Now, I do expect that we'll see some balance updates when the new edition comes out, so I don't necessarily expect that things like Defilers are going to be quite as ubiquitous as we see them currently. But assuming that nothing changes, I don't think Chaos Space Marines are really that impacted by the new mechanics that people are showcasing. In fact, in a lot of cases, they may be improved by them. A good example of this are the new Recover mechanics. Chaos Space Marines do tend to throw out a lot of kind of mid-AP attacks, but that have high reliability. So, for example, if we're discussing Pact-Bound Zealots, we can assume that a Defiler that's putting 2 Reaper autocannons and 2 Excruciator cannon shots down range is going to be firing upwards of 20 AP1 ranged attacks. Previously, those would be impacted by the +1 saving throw for cover, but now they're not. They will get -1 to hit. However, the fact that Chaos Space Marines in most of the competitive builds currently are reliant on hit rerolls stacked with critical hit effects and improved critical hits means that hitting on 3s versus 4s isn't that big of a deal, because a lot of times what we're doing is just fishing for 5-ups anyway. So the fact that our natural hits are going to be very marginally worse doesn't really change the math on these guys all that much, especially in conjunction with a lot of other factions who aren't necessarily going to be as reliant on rerolls. That said, as well, a ubiquitous benefit of playing Chaos is that you do have invulnerable saves, access to invulnerable saves very consistently. A lot of the possessed or demonic infantry will just have baked in invulnerable saves. Abaddon the Despoiler, if he's not giving you hit rerolls for your Defilers, can flip into giving his units invulnerable saves, so you can make them more difficult to kill in that way. And there's just a lot of just random random units that have invuln saves. And the fact that invuln saves are essentially just purely improved by the new cover mechanics, more often than not, even if you have a strong armor save and an invuln save, AP characteristics are going to punch you through to that invuln save anyway, and you're just getting the benefit of -1 to be hit thanks to the new cover rules, means that things that are primarily protected by invulns are actually slightly more difficult to kill than they were in the previous edition, which is great. Chaos Space Marines also have a sub-theme of battle shock effects. Things like Raptors or some of their detachments that are worried about battle shock are going to get the benefits of the new battle shock keywords. So if I was a Chaos Space Marine player, I would be kind of crossing my fingers to not see too many changes to the faction, because right now it does look like they are looking fairly strong. And speaking of strong factions, let's talk about Chaos Demons, because this might be in the running for one of the most improved factions in the game, assuming no other changes are made to them. This is because both the new cover and the new psychic mechanics are enormous improvements. Chaos Demons in the past essentially didn't benefit from cover. There were very rare circumstances where a strong armor save demon, so like a Blood Crusher or Scarbrand or Be'lakor, who have a base 3+ save, could maybe get a cover save that would prevent them from being just reduced to their invulnerable saving throw, but I would say 95% of attacks targeting a demon army always hit the invulnerable save, which meant that the cover mechanics didn't really do anything for them. In addition to that, Chaos Demons, at least talking about them in the context of 10th edition, is an army essentially constructed around its big heavy units, its greater demons, and for those, gaining cover is going to be, I imagine, easier than it will be for infantry units. We know that a demon that is, or a monster or vehicle that is partially obscured by a terrain feature in 11th edition, just as in 10th, will be gaining the benefits of cover, whereas the implication from what we've seen so far is that infantry units will have to be either majority obscured or majority inside a terrain feature in order to get the benefits of cover. We haven't seen the exact rules for that, so I'm prognosticating a little bit, but what it looks like to me is that heavy things will more often gain the benefits. So this is just a strict defensive improvement for Chaos Demons. In addition to that, the new psychic reworks effectively give huge buffs to almost every single ranged attack that the army has. There are a few very specific standard ranged attacks that they have access to, things like soul grinders, skull cannons. A couple of the units may have some regular looking ranged attacks. However, for the most part, that ranged damage is coming out of things like Lords of Change or the Tzeentch demons or Be'lakor's shooting, and all of those have the psychic keyword. They're going to ignore cover naturally now, in addition to the fact that they're also not suffering -1 to the saving throw, or -1 to the AP characteristic functionally from the previous cover incarnation. Finding ways to ignore cover for Lords of Change was like one of the mini games of the faction in 10th edition. Lords of Change could do it naturally, but they didn't really want to have to. They wanted to stick with their sustain D3 mode on their gun. So being able to use things like Burning Chariots, for example, or teleporting them into positions where they could eke around cover in order to gain clean lines of sight onto their target made them just do dramatically more damage, because they could lock in one of their stronger weapon keywords and then just sit in that one. Now they don't have to worry about any of that. Now they're just going to be firing at whatever they want. They don't care about cover. They don't even care about bracketing. If a greater demon is damaged and firing a psychic weapon, it ignores the -1 to hit from the damage keyword. Assuming that the faction is unchanged, this alone, I think, pushes big, multiple Lord of Change Tzeentch demon armies absolutely through the stratosphere. And I would expect, if I were a demon player, to see balance changes to those models to make them less abusive, because if we just transitioned from 10th to 11th edition with no changes to datasheets or points values, Scintillating Legion would be everywhere. It would be crazy. In addition to that, demons are also another faction that benefits from battle shock synergies. The fact that their army rule can now apply to a single unit multiple times if it continues to suffer battle shock checks is huge. It also improves the lot of detachments that are focused on forcing battle shock checks on people. Plague Legion comes to mind, obviously, because you're going to be able to potentially force a lot of those, and that means a lot of potential damage from the army ability or from enhancements like Canker Blight to remove models in exchange for mortal wounds. All of those are going to be significantly more impactful. Another note about Chaos Demons is the fact that a lot of demon armies are reliant on Demonic Incursion right now, which is focused very heavily on 6-inch ingress moves or 6-inch deep strikes, which are going to be slightly less effective in the new edition, largely because they will likely require a 7-inch charge out of deep strike unless we see those mechanics change changed in their detachments specifically. Now, moving on to some of the cult-specific armies, Death Guard is pretty interesting. I would say this is an army that is most likely to see massive benefits from the new leader mechanics. Assuming that characters don't need to lead a unit to gain the benefits of their leadership abilities, this means that Death Guard armies, or Death Guard characters in a lot of cases, are hugely improved. The one that immediately comes to mind is, of course, the Lord of Contagion, who has multiple overlapping offensive buffs for his unit, and even if he doesn't have a unit, he's able to regenerate himself once he's destroyed. If these guys benefit from all of those things without having to have a unit attached to them, I think you might just see armies starting with 3 Lords of Contagion, or maybe 2, and one of them's by himself for utility and to rapid ingress and go threaten objectives and things like that, because the chances that a Lord of Contagion charges and kills 5 utility infantry, or even in some cases 10 light infantry by himself, is actually really high. So they can independently threaten objectives, and they can also plow 6 or 9 damage into most vehicles in the game as well, all the while being protected by their own ability to regenerate. So units like that look phenomenal. Typhus is another example, a character who already gets taken for his ability to just teleport in and deal mortal wounds to people. He's relatively tough to kill and can get a situational -1 to hit effect in melee without having to lead a unit. That's enormous. The other thing is that Death Guard in many cases also make heavy use of the fly keyword. Units like Fetid Blow Drones and Mortarion are seen in a lot of Death Guard compositions, and being able to fly over intervening objects with them is going to be a huge benefit. Being able to deploy Mortarion on the battlefield and then just run him over an intervening wall or something in order to make progress up the table allows you to position him much more offensively than you did previously. The same goes for things like bloat drones, which could deploy in a building, for example, and then hop over the wall that's protecting them and then start shooting at people. And it even, I think, improves the lot of things like melee bloat drones, flesh mower bloat drones, which previously had a difficult time actually getting themselves into engagement just because of the fact that they were having to maneuver around terrain features. Now they could just pay 2 inches of movement and go through those terrain features anyway. So a lot of these little units, as well as things like Mortarion, of course, are going to get these massive benefits from this new mechanic. Now, on the flip side, some of the staple units like Death Shroud Terminators may be a little depowered, assuming, as I mentioned before in the video, we don't see any changes to 6-inch ingress moves. Death Shroud Terminators specifically are very heavily reliant on those. Taliban Summoners is also a detachment that is very heavily reliant on 6-inch ingresses, and assuming that those are depowered, as I assume that they will be, that does make those mechanics and those units a little bit less useful. Now, let's move over to Emperor's Children, and this is another army that I think it gets massively impacted by the changes to the fly keyword. Emperor's Children tend to rely very heavily on specifically winged demon princes, but also other flying units, like in some cases Fulgrim, in order to move over intervening terrain features. And given the fact that their entire army is relatively high move characteristic and can advance and charge, paying 2 inches of movement to move over intervening terrain is not that big of a deal. So I think that the compositions that are currently using multiple demon princes, probably going to remain using them, assuming that there are no balance changes to those. There's also the fact that they can now use Crushing Impact, which is big, so monsters have an equivalent of Tank Shock, which can deal damage on the way in, which you can combo with the Demon Prince's ability to deal mortal wounds as well. So the fact that these units can now come in and have 2 instances of mortal wound application before they even make their attacks is absolutely enormous. That said, Emperor's Children is a faction, especially if you're playing the Coterie of the Conceited, that relies very heavily on removing individual enemy units. I do think that one way that a lot of units, and especially Space Marine squads, for example, tried to keep themselves alive from these little skirmishing Emperor's Children units was stacking multiple defensive buffs. A lot of times you would see Armor of Contempt plus a -1 to wound effect, for example, get put down onto a scout squad or, Incursors or something like that, and they would survive something like Infractors or Lord Exultant coming in just because they were able to put so many little defensive manipulations onto that interaction. And that would prevent Coterie of the Conceited buffs from accruing. That would stall the progress of the detached ability for Emperor's Children in a big way. And now you're no longer able to stack defensive buffs, which is a big deal. In some cases, that does make some varieties of Emperor's Children a little bit unhappy. Previously, for example, Coterie did like to stack Feel No Pains with Armor of Contempt, and you can't do that anymore. However, the fact that Emperor's Children are engaging a lot of times in a peace trade and do tend to be kind of command point starved in a lot of cases means that I don't know necessarily if this is going to be a massive change for them. It does make their Demon Princes a little bit easier to kill, but given the fact that they are faster, like in comparison and do more damage potentially, means that I think it's probably a pretty solid trade. Now, it's not all peachy because unfortunately, Emperor's Children do in some cases rely very heavily on the fights first rule, which I think is not going to be quite as important anymore. Units like Fulgrim had it in some cases built in. There are also enhancements to gain it. They've already discussed detachments that are giving it to units in the army. And the fact that it no longer automatically attacks before any incoming charging units means that having a broad spectrum of first fight is the only way to get a lot of value from the mechanic. So just having it on Lucius the Eternal or Fulgrim, for example, and your opponent being able to engage these one-off characters that have them means that your opponent's just going to be attacking those and killing them first, which in some cases could give you a nice counter-assault in order to fight back. However, Emperor's Children are a very offensive army. They don't tend to do as much damage on defense. So playing defensively like that is not necessarily quite as helpful. So the fights first ability in some cases allowed Emperor's Children to deploy more aggressively against opposing melee armies or to protect themselves on the counterattack if they would commit into a target and then layer in fight first units inside their formation and then heroically intervene and attack with them. They no longer have the opportunity to do that as easily as they did previously, and I do think that they're just going to make some meaningful changes. It certainly makes you reconsider the inclusion of Lucius the Eternal, I think, in a lot of cases, because without fights first, he's a much less dangerous opponent. And that moves us on to Thousand Sons, another primarily psychic army that's going to go absolutely insane with the changes to the psychic keyword. Having direct fire units like Sorcerers or Magnus the Red totally ignore cover as a baseline is kind of wild because that's not something they ever did before. Also, the ability to ignore modifiers with them is huge. Magnus the Red, like we talked about with Lords of Change, also doesn't degrade at all. He'll get -1 to hit, but because all of his attacks are psychic, he'll then ignore the -1 to hit, so who really cares? In addition to that, Thousand Sons is a faction that relies extremely heavily, maybe more heavily than any other faction, on the Overwatch mechanic, and they do so in a different way to a lot of armies, whereas things like Chaos Space Marines or Space Marines in the past have relied on Overwatch in conjunction with reroll hit effects. So, for example, the use of Oath of Moment or Abaddon's reroll aura in addition to Overwatch to secure those critical hits. Now that you're not able to reroll hits on Overwatch, those mechanics are going to be a little bit tougher to utilize. However, Thousand Sons rely very heavily on torrent weapons, which we know so far are not changing on Overwatch, as well as just improved Overwatch mechanics. So things like the Thousand Sons Defiler, which can potentially be hitting on 4s in Overwatch. And previously, you could essentially bait out Overwatch, right? You would move a lot of your utility units around. You would spend a lot of time making meaningful moves that your opponent could respond to Overwatch with in order to give them the opportunity to use Overwatch before you would make your more impactful moves. And that lets you get value even in the face of strong Overwatch, right? Because you're able to make very aggressive plays that incentivize your opponent to Overwatch them. However, they're potentially holding their Overwatch for a more impactful play later on. You can no longer do that in the new edition. Overwatch just happens at the end of the movement phase, which means your opponent gets to see every move that you make. So if you are threatening a bunch of pretty impactful, but not necessarily game-ending moves. So for example, I'm going to move up a bunch of utility, disruption pieces to attack your expansion objective before I move my big hammer blow brick unit. My opponent could choose to gain value in Overwatch against those units in order to protect their expansion objective, or they could wait until my big hammer blow brick unit goes and then shoot that if they wanted to. In the new context, I'm going to make all those moves and my opponent gets full information about what all my charges look like, where those models are going to be moving, what potential reactions they have to them before I make any additional plays. So it's much more difficult to circumvent Overwatch now, whereas in the past I could just see if my opponent overwatched early in the phase and then use that information to inform my later moves. They can just operate and always take the most effective Overwatch. They are restricted to the movement phase. They're not going to be quite as able to respond in the charge phase as they were previously. But in my opinion, this does make movement phase Overwatch actually stronger than it was in the past. It doesn't mean also that you can't necessarily overwatch at the start of a movement, which is good, so units running away aren't going to be killed as easily, but I don't think that's quite as impactful as killing units before they activate into your army. So I do think that in many cases, the new Overwatch mechanics are actually an improvement for Thousand Sons, despite the fact that they aren't necessarily the case for a lot of other armies. In addition to that, the new fly and character rules are also going to be very beneficial to Thousand Sons. Previously, it wasn't really kosher, or wasn't really useful to take units or characters like sorcerers, exalted sorcerers, especially like disc sorcerers, for example, all by themselves because they wouldn't benefit from their leadership ability. They're expensive. You are paying a premium for these characters that were kind of reliant on Rubric Marines to get a lot of work done. And in fairness, a lot of these characters are vastly improved by Rubric Marines. However, many of them do get massive benefits by themselves. So for example, a standard sorcerer being able to throw all their attacks out with natural lethal hits is going to be helpful. Disc sorcerers having an 18-inch lone operative without having to attach into a Zangor Enlightened unit is going to be crazy good. So I do think there are some cases in which those models are going to be improved. In addition to that, there's a lot of flying inside Thousand Suns. Zangor Enlightened, for example, as we just mentioned, do have fly, so they're now able to hop over intervening terrain features that they had to move around previously. They aren't the fastest thing in the world. However, they do have the opportunity to make multiple moves over the course of a turn. So if, for example, you make a 4-inch temporal surge move that does allow a Zangor unit that's up against a structure to hop over the structure and get to the other side of the terrain feature, the other side of the wall that they're sitting next to. Depending on the width of the wall, obviously, it has to be smaller than a half-inch, essentially. But units that are already widely played, like Magus the Red and Winged Demon Princes, gaining the benefits of that movement is enormous. Now, moving on to World Eaters, these guys are a little difficult to really review because we don't know what a lot of the new combat rules are going to look like. There are obviously updated rules for charging, which can change some interactions that World Eaters have been on the victim end of in 10th edition. However, things like piling consolidation moves, which World Eaters use quite a bit to do things like combat slingshots, are going to be a little bit more nebulous at the time of recording, so we don't know 100% what they're going to look like. That said, the capacity for World Eaters to gain engagement range with extended engagement range or the 2-inch engagement range that we have on models that are trying to wall screen themselves is a big deal. That does mean it's more difficult to wall screen yourself against World Eaters and prevent yourself from being charged, which is good. However, there is also a downside to that mechanic, that being that it now requires longer charges, longer rolls to make your charge successful, since you're going to have to go an additional inch. In a lot of cases, that's not going to be impactful, but if you're a World Eaters player, for example, and a lot of your game plan relies around making 2, 3, 4, 5 charges a turn, adding one to each of those charges and moving it one step down the bell curve makes it exponentially less likely that you confirm all of those charges that you have. Now, World Eaters do have a reroll charge mechanic baked into their army ability, but that only works if you roll it using Blessings of Khorne, and it takes the place of another Blessing of Khorne. So you're doing so in place of additional damage output. Now, that said, I do think that World Eaters are going to see some big benefits from the new character rules, as well as the fly mechanics. There are obviously units like Angron, for example, are very widely played in a lot of World Eaters compositions, and Angron being able to hop over walls is enormous. On top of that, a lot of World Eaters characters do really idiosyncratically rely on attached units. A really good example of this is like Lord Invocatus, for example, who can deep strike but can't run through walls if he's not with a unit of infantry, which doesn't really make sense, but gaining the ability to do so even while not attached, because he no longer needs to benefit from that leadership ability, means you can use things like Juggernaut Lords or Invocatus to act as these utility units, essentially as independent little individual disruption pieces. The chances that a Juggernaut Lord with a boatload of attacks, especially depending on the detachment you're in, converts into 5 2-wound infantry, for example, is pretty high. So being able to utilize those characters for relatively cheap objective disruption is actually a huge deal. Now, moving over to Xenos factions, we'll start with Aeldari and Drukhari. This is another cardinal sin I've committed to attach these two factions together, because a lot of the things I found that I was writing down for one faction, I ended up writing for the other one. So kind of like Imperial and Chaos Knights. These are sort of two sides of the same coin. These are both armies that rely very heavily on light infantry, and they're also both armies that rely very heavily on flying vehicles. And I do think that the context of all of these unit types have changed pretty significantly. A big thing is that low save, high invuln light infantry are going to be much more survivable in comparison to 10th edition, because they didn't really get the cover mechanic in 10th edition. Something like Witches, for example, it's like a 6+ invuln with not really an armor save, didn't really care about being in cover in 10th. However, now in some cases will be -1 to hit in 11th. That is actually a very impactful change. And the same goes for a lot of other infantry. That said, I don't think that a lot of for example, the 4+ save light infantry squads are going to be as survivable because you don't have that +1 save to fall back on against a lot of like AP0 small arms fire. You're not saving on 3s in a lot of cases, you're saving on 4s, and as long as they have ways to get around cover or they aren't necessarily that impacted by cover, they're going to mop you up pretty quickly. I do think that, in addition to the fact that objective markers are now essentially always in the open, and that's not 100% true, but more often than not, controlling an objective marker will require that your unit enters into a terrain feature, which then means that they are visible, means that units that were designed to hold objective markers while outside line of sight are going to be less consistent. And for both Aeldari and Drukhari, this is a big deal for both these factions. They really relied on the use of small, cheap, light infantry squads to hold down an objective and force the opponent to come into them in order to disrupt it, and then trade down into a meaningless utility unit and get counterattacked and lose valuable units. I don't think that's going to be quite as easy. For example, let's say we're going to go touch a side objective with a ranger. That ranger now must be in that terrain feature, and your opponent can likely gain lines of sight around corners and things to shoot them and kill them. And given the fact that stealth no longer also combines with cover, units like Rangers or Mandrakes, for example, are going to be easier to kill in the comparison to a lot of other light infantry. So I do think Aeldari kind of come out on the bad end of some of these terrain and cover changes, despite the fact that light infantry would typically be benefited by cover. That said, their other unit archetypes are massively improved. Things like grav tanks and bikers being able to use the new fly keyword to move over intervening terrain features immediately makes these unit profiles significantly stronger. So that includes things like Ravagers and Wave Serpents, Falcons, Fire Prisms, all of these styles of units that are very voluminous, so they have to try very hard not to be seen. However, that oftentimes meant that they were then so far back and out of the fight that they wouldn't be able to come back in because they had to go around intervening terrain features. Something like a Eldar vehicle that's able to move, between 12 and 16 inches, to then just pay 2 inches of that movement to hop over intervening terrain makes it much easier to deploy these things in a defensible position. A lot of these units also sport high volume, low AP shooting. So things like Wind Riders who are running, AP1 shuriken cannons, for example, those would get really brutalized by cover, and you oftentimes had to bring them alongside units that would either improve their AP or give them ignores cover. Now you don't necessarily have to do that, and so they are going to be dealing a little bit more damage than we would have expected of them. Now, I think there's also a small mention to be made of the new terrain layouts. They do seem to be a little bit more conducive to smaller units that would previously get stuck behind terrain features, so like smaller monsters and vehicles, for example. And it does seem like there is more defensive posturing available to these units. So units like Wraith Lords, like the Avatar of Cain, like Talos, for example, may be slightly improved. I'm not 100% sure. Now, it would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the new Battle Shock changes are going to be massive for Drukhari. Drukhari do gain pain tokens when enemies fail Battle Shock checks, and the fact that they are now taking more and more Battle Shock checks as the game goes on in order to undo that Battle Shock is kind of an enormous deal. Now, moving on to Genestealer Cults, this was another faction where I wasn't really sure necessarily what direction they were going to go in. Genestealer Cults are going to get the nice benefit of having a lot of low save units that gain the benefits of the new cover mechanics, and the fact that deep strikes are also easier to deliver, it does help mass deep strike composition. So if you're playing something like Day of Ascension, where you're dropping lots of infantry, they're all going to make ranged attacks out of deep strike, it actually helps quite a bit there. Now, the downside, of course, is that I think that slingshot mechanics are going to be a little bit tougher. Now, obviously, we don't have the full fight phase and combat movement rules necessarily to say this, but detachments like Biosanctic Breed Surge that rely on a lot of kind of knife-edge charges and then utilizing slingshots and extended pile and consolidate moves in order to get characters into important places on the battlefield. I don't know necessarily if those are going to be as easy to do. If there are onboard charges, those are going to be more difficult to actually enact because you do need to roll one higher inch in order to get those charges into engagement range. So that is going to make things tougher for early game interaction. So things like hybrid metamorphs and pure strength Genestealers who are on the table or coming out of transports and trying to get into melee, those are going to have a little bit of a tough time. Now, Genestealer Cults are a character-centric faction. That said, a lot of their characters do rely on having units to buff, so I don't know necessarily if there are going to be changes to whether or not characters are going to be helpful when leading units or not. I also think that because Genestealer Cults tends to be a very aggressive army that tends to put a lot of stuff in their opponent's face very quickly, while also being one that is susceptible to Overwatch in a big way. A lot of times you're just losing whole units to Overwatch because you tend to be light infantry and sometimes in small model counts. The ability for your opponent to just Overwatch after all your deep strikers have come in, for example, means that there's really no counterplay to Overwatch besides just having anti-Overwatch effects. So if we're trying to get like demolition charge drops or ranged attacks, neophyte hybrids to shoot at a target that's close by, for example, and we need to worry about a unit that's very effective in Overwatch, we're just going to have to eat it to the face unless we have any things that prevent Overwatch from happening, and I do think that that is going to be a meaningful change to the faction. Now, moving over to Leagues of Votann, this is a faction that relies extremely heavily on mass low AP shooting, and so the cover mechanics in 10th edition were a big deal for them. You really had to find ways to circumvent cover in order to be successful as a Leagues of Votann player, and oftentimes that meant that you had to rely extremely heavily on units like Brokir Thunderkin. They were sort of just a staple of the army in order to get around cover. However, a lot of the new cover mechanics are actually kind of synergistic with how Leagues of Votann work. Now, I will say that Votann did rely heavily on the defensive aspects of cover in a big way because they were looking to stack armor saving throws, right? They'd have AP reduction effects in addition to 2+ armor saves across a wide breadth of their army, and losing access to that is going to mean that Leagues of Votann is more difficult to kill for the majority of units. There are going to be units like Hernkin Jaegers and Chthonian Berserks that will be, on average, a little bit more difficult to destroy, but most of the time, we were really hoping to stack up these armor saves to the point your opponent wouldn't be able to interact with them, and Leagues of Votann aren't really able to do that anymore. That said, things that naturally ignore ballistic skill modifiers inside the Votann faction are going to be crazy, because a lot of times they are throwing these low AP attacks downrange, which were massively impacted by cover, but now they just ignore those entirely. So things like Hecatan Land Fortresses, for example, that just ignore ballistic skill characteristic modifiers for their attacks, means that they're just shooting into cover with mass twin-linked AP1 sustained hits, all these keywords on top of their weapon profiles, and are able to just drill through enemy infantry that are hiding in cover. In addition to that, I want to say that the Grimnir actually looks like kind of a sweet unit. He has a psychic weapon, so he's not going to be impacted by the new cover rules. He comes in with a 6 shots AP2 D3 damage gun that now no longer has to worry about shooting into cover, which is huge. In addition to the fact that he also grants his unit naturally a Feel No Pain, which will affect both him and his corvs, even if he's on his own, assuming that the leadership effects change as they have been described to. So you have this 6 wound character with a 5+ Feel No Pain. Those wounds are distributed amongst multiple models, so you can sometimes take multi-damage attacks and have bleed over wounds not carry over, and you have a very reasonable ranged attack that naturally ignores the cover effect. That also means that a lot of your attack activations have divorced themselves from requiring Brokir Thunderkin, which allows you to take Brokir Thunderkin units as more offensive pieces instead of support pieces, so that puts more emphasis on things like these Ancestral Sentence combos, where you can take Conversion Beamers in addition to improved critical hit and sustained hit effects, plus rerolls in order to deal massive damage with these units. The downside was always that that would then mean you had one activation that wasn't stripping cover from enemies to then improve your other ranged attacks, like the ones from your land fortresses, and now you could just use Brokir Thunderkin units on their own to buff each other. This also means that you could even start to see support Thunderkin units that are playing bolt cannons, which were always kind of a joke previously. The big benefit is that it allows them to engage from 36 inches away rather than 24, so they're less often in the line of fire, and then they can debuff enemies and strip cover so that your big multi-damage conversion beamer units can just clear out those enemies. I think there's a lot of more interesting builds that get opened up by removing the necessity for Brokir Thunderkin for a lot of your attack activations to be useful. Now, the downside here, of course, worse is that a lot of Leagues of Votann units are going to be slow. They're move 10, or they're move 5, in some cases move 6. There might be some buffs in there in some instances. However, the fact that all charges need to roll extra distance to get into engagement means that I think Votann armies are going to be failing a lot more charges than they expect to. Even in 10th edition, a lot of Votann game plans were reliant very heavily on like making 6 or making 7-inch charges, and now you're just not able. It's going to be significantly more difficult to make those. So that may point towards the use of a more support-oriented detachment, something like Delve Assault Shift, to make use of your melee units, your Chthonian Berserks, by speeding them up, and then you can use another one detachment point detachment to like buff your other units, like your ranged attackers and stuff like that. I don't know. It's probably going to make a shift in how Leagues of Votann armies are constructed in order to make those melee units more consistent, but at the very least, their ranged profiles look incredibly good with these changes. That said, as well, we are also seeing some changes to ingress moves, and so I do think that short-range deep strikers are going to be impacted by that. This is explicitly things like Einhir Hearthguard, which are used a lot of times in these smaller units to just clear enemy utility, and being able to drop those that much closer to a target is a huge deal. That opens up a lot more options for their positioning and potentially helps them get short-range, half-range shots on enemies and close-range shots on enemies for Hearthband armies to deal damage with those guys. Necrons are an army that I think is going to see a lot of improvements to their larger units. Things like their big quantum vehicles basically get improved in almost every way by these new mechanics. The one downside is that if you don't have something like Solar Pulse that can strip cover from enemies, you are going to be impacted by cover in a big way. You're shooting these like low volume, high impact attacks that would normally punch through most cover saves from 10th edition, but now get the -1 to hit. However, because most Necron combat vehicles, any of the Quantum Shielded vehicles, have kind of a middling or even non-existent armor save, but very strong invulnerable saves, they tended to not get the benefit of cover enemy against enemy anti-tank, and now we're going to be just harder to kill. In addition to that, they can potentially get around that debuff from cover just by the fact that the new heavy mechanics are very good for a lot of these very like voluminous vehicles, because as long as they're just moving 3 inches, Doomsday Arcs, for example, are going to be able to consistently deal damage. We don't necessarily know how the rotational rules from 10th edition are going to transition over. Right now, it costs you 2 inches of movement to rotate, which for a Doomsday Arc is an enormous amount of movement. If that doesn't change in the new edition, that means a Doomsday Arc can rotate and then move 1 inch and still benefit from the heavy keyword, which is going to be massive to gain +1 to hit and get around opposing cover saves. But even if you don't get those benefits, having fly and allowing you to traverse over terrain or traverse over models and still fire, and especially in like Star Shatter Arsenal, for example, being able to advance, pay 2 inches of movement, go through a terrain feature without having to spend any command points is enormous. And if you really need the extra 2 inches, you can spend a command point to go through the terrain. But having mass fly and vulnerable save protected vehicles, I think is going to be huge for vehicle play in Necrons. In addition to that, changes to leader mechanics do mean that Necron smash characters are slightly more improved. That is going to be the case for Scorpic Lords, for example, which get played in Awakened Dynasty on their own to deal mortal wounds. Gaining their own lethal hits without having to have a unit attached to Scorpic, destroyer unit attached, is a pretty big deal, although oftentimes you want to take the Scorpic destroyers anyway. And speaking of those Scorpic destroyers, they are infantry, so they are going to be benefited from the heavy or the hidden mechanic, which I think is, as we talked about in Adeptus Custodes, a big deal for heavy infantry. Relatively, I don't want to say Scorpic destroyers are extremely difficult to kill, but they are relatively difficult to kill. A random unit running in to shoot them with an anti-infantry gun isn't going to kill them. You're going to need some dedicated sort of heavy infantry killing to actually remove the unit, which means that they can deploy a little bit more aggressively and actually threaten the center of the table a little bit more reliably in the early game, as long as your opponent doesn't have counterplay to the hidden mechanic. So I do think that it is going to most likely improve them very slightly. Now, moving on from there over to Orks, this is another codex that we're likely to see on launch, and so it's really difficult to discuss how this faction is going to be doing with the context of the new codex. I do think that the new cover rules impact Orks maybe more than almost any other faction. They are very good for Orc defensive profiles, since Orcs don't tend to have very strong armor saves outside of explicitly like battle wagons and mega knobs. So the fact that it's mass light infantry, and oftentimes it's going to be light infantry that are hiding in terrain features to perform actions and utility roles, means that it is going to be a little bit more annoying to kill things like random Grecian squads or storm boys or commandos that are running around the battlefield. That said, Orks having a universal, essentially, base 5+ ballistic skill and having that be reduced to a 6+ ballistic skill by cover means that unless you have consistent ways to get around cover, and I mean, who knows what's going to be in the new codex, unless that stuff gets included, I don't really see a way forward for Ork shooting, at least Ork anti-vehicle shooting, because a lot of vehicles are going to be in cover, and then you're just rolling out 6s to hit against them, which is really not that useful. Now, there are some instances of ignore cover in the faction. There's things like rerolls from Ludas and stuff, for example. So it's not like it's all bad, and the heavy keyword improvements are going to help out a lot of units that are reliant on heavy, but generally speaking, a lot of like rocket launcher equipped units, I think, are going to have a really tough time punching into armored vehicles, assuming that those armored vehicles are just a toe behind a terrain feature, for example. Now, we are waiting to see the full charge and combat movement rules. I do have a sneaking suspicion that combat movement is largely going to require that your models pile in to engage a unit that they're currently engaging. A lot of the articles that we discussed at the very beginning of the preview season sort of implied that combat movement, pile-in movement would be a little bit more restrained. And if that's the case, the current incarnation of Orks puts a lot of energy into delivering characters as the primary damage dealers for a unit. So if you have 20 Ork boys, the 20 Ork boys themselves aren't really the ones actually dealing damage. It's the war boss and the knob inside those units with power claws. So if we do see the reduced efficiency of combat slingshots, those interactions are going to be different, but I have to hazard a guess that with the new codex, there will be different ways to play the faction. It's just gonna depend on what is in their new rulebook. Now that moves us over to Tyranids, and Tyranids are in a very interesting place because this was a faction that previously in 10th edition suffered a lot of the downsides of having low AP shooting. They had a lot of psychic weapons, which was just a strict debuff to your weapon profile, and they rely very heavily on battle shock effects, which are kind of inconsistent, and basically all of those things have been improved. Cover no longer gives a benefit to your armor save, which means low AP shooting and low AP attacks are going to be that much more effective against them. Tyranids do have ways to get around cover. They can either strip it, they have ways to ignore it, and they do now just have a bunch of psychic weapons, which is helpful. In addition to that, they were one of the few recipients, I think it was like Tyranids and Drukhari largely, had non-ignore cover torrent weapons, which became really awkward to use in 10th edition, but now that torrent automatically ignores cover alongside psychic, the breadth of Tyranid utility, of Tyranid weapon profiles is massively improved. So things like the Swarmlord, things like Acid Spray Tyrannifexes can now fire around cover and don't get any of the debuffs at all, which makes them significantly more impressive. In addition to that, heavy changes are really good for things like Exocrines and Tyrannifexes, which will rely on that +1 to hit to get around opposing cover if they aren't using torrent weapons, and being able to move, and as we talked about in the Necron section, potentially swing those big bodies and those big long guns around to gain lines of sight to things while still gaining +1 to hit is enormous for that. I have a sneaking suspicion, and I know Games Workshop's trying to pull away from this style of composition, but it seems like every change they're making is actually just beneficial to like low model count, high impact activations. It feels to me like Tyranids are trending towards more monster-oriented armies that are taking big psychic monsters like Maleceptors or Norns or Tyrannifexes, for example, because a lot of the changes are hugely beneficial to those units in specific. And obviously that includes the psychic changes, which are massive for things like Zoanthropes, Maleceptors, Norn Emissaries, all of whom have psychic weapons that are a little bit below par for their points value, generally speaking, but now that they just essentially ignore cover automatically, I think are going to see a massive improvement. In addition to that, we've also seen previewed a Norn detachment for Tyranids, which I think can slot into a lot of their existing compositions, where if you're already playing something like Invasion Fleet with Norn Emissaries, you can now just pay a detachment point and those Norn Emissaries get strictly better, which is just a massive improvement for a unit that is already getting better thanks to its improved weapon keywords. And that moves us on, last but certainly not least, to Tau Empire, who are looking pretty good, despite the fact that you would assume that hidden mechanics, in addition to the changes to cover and things like that, would debuff Tau Empire, it does seem to me like they are actually coming out of the edition transition looking fairly strong. That includes changes to the fly mechanic, as we've been talking about throughout the entire video. Units that are big gunships and things like that are going to be able to hide behind a terrain feature and then hop through that or over that terrain feature using the take flight rule in order to get around terrain features and then gain line of sight to things is going to be massive. And Tau have a huge breadth of flying vehicles. That includes standard battlesuits, Riptide battlesuits, Skyray gunships, hammerheads, even just the ability to like Mont Ka Auto 6 advance a Devilfish through a terrain feature and then disembark breachers on the other side is going to be massive. And so I think that Tau are looking incredibly maneuverable with their faction-wide use of fly. Now, there is a funny idiosyncrasy that happens to a lot of these like parking lot style builds that are using the fly keyword, where you now are required to take flight and pay the 2 inches of movement to have things like crisis battlesuits move around each other, because otherwise they aren't able to move through friendly vehicle units. That's the implication of the rules previews that we've had so far anyway. However, I think that's a small price to pay to be able to deploy those units more aggressively in more aggressive positions, knowing that you now don't need to pay movement to go all the way around a ruin and can simply go all the way through it. And especially with how maneuverable some Tau detachments can be, that's going to be massive. In addition to that, a lot of these units are massively improved by the changes to Deep Strike, where you're now able to ingress move 8 inches away from enemies instead of 9, which turns on a lot of your natural buffs. So things like if you can extend the range of a Sunforge battlesuit team to range 18, you gain Melta within 9, and you can now Deep Strike within 9 to gain that Melta on those guys. And that is a combination that's made possible by the new detachments available to Tau and the changes to the core rules. In addition to that, they really ignore a lot of the downsides of cover, especially using the marker light, a keyword to observe units that just removes cover from them. So you don't really care that much about the changes to cover in most cases anyway. I will mention, though, that there are some instances where stuff like Riptide battlesuits that have weapon support systems would normally ignore hit modifiers, but because it covers a ballistic skill modifier, it will actually still apply, at least based on the current rules. I don't know if any of that stuff is going to be changing. A lot of the new hidden mechanics as well, it seems like Tau have a lot of ways to mitigate those. So we've already seen previewed several ways to do that by either using Pathfinders or Ghost Keels who can give themselves additional detection range on their own, or you can use auxiliary units to increase detection range of enemy units. So it does feel like Tau is going to have to play a little bit more close to their target in order to get around intervening terrain features and cover that's going to be in the center of the table, but and also get in range of the hidden keyword. However, they will have ways to prevent enemies from abusing the hidden keyword against them, because they are going to have a lot of ways to extend that detection range. I will mention as well that I do think that the change to objective markers might be one of the biggest ones for Tau. Obviously, like a way to just wait out a lot of Tau compositions in 10th edition was simply to put units on objectives that weren't necessarily susceptible to smart missile system shooting, and then just like sit there for the entire game and either force the Tau player to overcommit to try to clear your objectives or just threaten a win on primary towards the late game. And that would require that the Tau player like play really aggressively, and they could potentially play into a closer range melee army's hands. Now that objective markers are terrain features, it's going to be that much more difficult to hide units entirely out of line of sight on those objectives. So Tau armies will very often be able to come in and shoot into them. Now, I'm very curious about one particular interaction, and this is going to be a big change for not only Tau, but also a lot of other potential gun line style armies, and that is the interaction between things like ingress moves and hidden, because hidden applies to units that are in terrain features that haven't made any attacks during their previous turn or up until that point in the game. And if you have ingressed onto the battlefield that turn, that automatically means that that's the case. So I do think that there is a little bit of counterplay that's implied by the current rules that we've seen previewed that allows you to do things like rapid ingress units into terrain features, but outside 15 inches of enemies, to a position where they are going to start hidden as soon as they're on the battlefield and your opponent's not able to attack them. Now, I don't know that that is going to be the case. It could be a thing that rapid ingress moves prevent you from being hidden that round, or that it's just a requirement of hidden that you are on the battlefield in your movement phase or something like that. But if that is the case, I do think there is going to be some eminent counterplay to a lot of these gun lines. And so I will caveat this discussion about Tau that not only are they going to be forced to play more farther forward, which isn't necessarily the worst thing ever, because some detachments in Tau can give them huge benefits for playing more aggressively, but I will say that the core roles may also have some counterplay to these gunline armies. So with that, that's every faction in Warhammer 40k, and my thoughts about them moving on to 11th edition. Big thanks to Wicked Dicey and their Slaughter event for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.